All right, everybody, we are back with our discussion of drug policy. So, we're going to dive right in here and start talking about policing during the war on drugs and this heightened focus on drugs and drug policy in the latter parts of the 20th century. So, one of the things that this war on drugs brought us was a financial motivation for police to focus on drug crimes because there was a law passed that says that anything seized from drug dealers which were used in the commission of a crime, and this was interpreted very broadly, could be seized by the police and then used, either sold and the cash used, or used in itself by the police. So this meant that if police busted a cocaine dealer and that cocaine dealer happened to use their fancy car to transport their drugs to those they were selling it to, police could seize that car and then either sell it for money and keep the money or use that car for part of their policing efforts, right? Um, so everything from guns to cars to cash to computers to whatever, if they're used by drug dealers, drug sellers, or even drug buyers, they can be seized by police, giving them this kind of financial motivation to go after people who are committing these crimes. Now, at that point, police kind of had to look at what are the low-hanging fruit. What group of these criminals are going to be the easiest for us to go out and investigate and catch and arrest and drive up our numbers so that we look good, right? We arrested 500 drug dealers this month. Aren't we amazing? We're wonderful police, yay! And what they kind of very quickly figured out was that the open air markets, the places where drugs are being sold just kind of out and about in the, outside, are much easier to investigate and arrest than the ones that happen kind of behind closed doors. And this makes sense, but what this meant was in poor areas where drug dealers had to deal kind of out of their houses, those became much more heavily focused on by police. Whereas on Wall Street, Wall Street stockbrokers and such, bankers were consuming tons of cocaine, but they always bought their drugs from people kind of in business suits behind closed doors in fancy buildings. And those were much more difficult to investigate and generate a case to get to the point where you could arrest somebody. So if we only have so many police officers and so many hours in the day to do these investigations, let's go after the easy ones in the poor areas and get a ton of arrests rather than spending the exact same amount of time and effort on many, many fewer arrests in these kind of richer areas where people are abusing drugs just as much, but we can't kind of see it or obtain evidence as easily, right? And because poor areas were much more heavily minority occupied, this meant that minority racial groups, whether that means black or Native American or Hispanic or, choose a minority group, those groups were vastly overrepresented among arrestees for drug selling and drug buying and drug using. Whereas the relatively rich areas, which were overwhelmingly white, saw much less enforcement, much less investigation, not because of, ostensibly not because of overt racism, but just because those were much more easy targets for the police to drive their numbers up and say, hey, we got all these arrests. And what this then led to was prison overcrowding, right? So if you look at the population of United States prisons, it absolutely shot through the roof, even as a percentage of the population at the time. Starting in the 70s with the war on drugs, huge increase in the 80s and 90s with the war on drugs. And we got massive, massive amounts of people being sent to prison overwhelmingly for drug crimes, to the point where our prisons were just overflowing with people. And it's only just recently, just in the past, say, 10 years, have we kind of peaked with our prison population, and it now is just starting to kind of slowly drop from its peak in the early part of the 21st century. Now, one of the things we've developed to try to help with drug use and drug crime is drug courts, okay? And these are for people, usually first-time offenders. If you get caught using drugs or possessing drugs, you can go to one of these specialized drug courts, which deals only with drug cases, and they're kind of specially designed to help people that are not necessarily hardcore criminals. They don't need to go to prison for a long time. Maybe they just need some help, getting off drugs, getting rid of this addiction. So there's kind of two different ways that a drug court can work, and that's pre-adjudication or post-adjudication. And when it's done pre-adjudication, basically what they say is, hey, you've been arrested for this crime. You could theoretically, if you're found guilty, be sent to prison for 2 years or 5 years or whatever it is. But if you complete this rehabilitation program and do a good job staying clean, we'll dismiss the charges. So that person then is sent to this rehab program. They're given some kind of help. And then if they do a good job, if they stay clean, if they don't get into further trouble, the charges are dropped before they're convicted. Post-adjudication, basically they go through with the criminal case, they get investigated, and if they get found guilty, they're kind of given an option. They say, okay, I'm sentencing you, the judge will say, I'm sentencing you to 2 years in prison, but as an alternative, you can do this rehab program. And if you kind of successfully complete that and stay clean, we'll go in and say, okay, that counts as your time served and you don't actually have to go to prison, right? So it's just kind of based on whether the kind of criminal case and criminal punishment gets handed down first, or the criminal case and the criminal punishment only actually happen if the person fails in their kind of alternative process that drug court has. And then kind of there's a third option where in that drug court, the judge gets to decide whether to do the intervention pre-adjudication or post-adjudication, and they kind of have an option. But in most places, it's kind of dictated either by law or by court policy that they have to do it either pre or post. Now, one of the problems with drug courts is that they focus on only the low-risk people, right? These are the people who, first-time offenders, no other criminal record, etc., etc. But as we'll talk about here in a minute, those are the people that probably don't really need the help that much anyway. It's the high-risk people that need the help, right? And then another problem here is it's really, really difficult to kind of go through as a researcher and grade how well these drug courts are doing. Are they actually reducing recidivism? Are they getting people off drugs permanently? Are they better than the alternative? Because of a problem called selection bias, right? So basically, what selection bias means is we've got these two groups, right? The people who are going to drug court and having their cases adjudicated in drug court, and the people who are just going to prison for these drug crimes. And if we look after 5 years and look at the recidivism rates, the fact that they're different and the drug court people might have a much lower recidivism rate, much lower rearrest rate, that might be due to the fact that they went through this drug court and got this help. But it also might be due to the fact that those two groups were different to begin with. They were different before any of this process ever started. And the way to control for selection bias is to do random assignment, right? So the next 1,000 people who get arrested for drugs, we're going to flip a coin. And if you get a heads, you get sent to the drug court. And if you get a tails, you get sent to the regular criminal court. The problem with that kind of random assignment is it has all kinds of legal and moral issues that make it very difficult to do that kind of actual random assignment. that would kind of statistically ensure that the two groups are really similar before this process begins. So because we can't say for sure that the two groups were different or the same prior to this drug court versus traditional court, traditional criminal process thing happens, means we can't actually say whether any differences seen afterwards are really due to the fact that one group went through this drug court process and the other group went through the traditional criminal justice process. Now, deterrence really hasn't worked on crime in general, but it especially doesn't work with drugs. Okay? And again, as I said in the previous section, deterrence just doesn't have a lot of evidence to support it, but it really doesn't work well with drugs. Because again, doing drugs is not a rational choice. People don't wake up one morning and think, you know what? I've weighed the pros and cons, I've looked at this logically, and I've decided I'm going to become a heroin addict. Nobody does that, right? It's not a rational choice to either buy drugs or even to sell drugs. Kind of case in point, evidence number one is Afghanistan, right? In Afghanistan, we have all these farmers who are growing opium poppies and then selling that opium to drug manufacturers who turn it into morphine and heroin and all these other assorted opiate illegal drugs. But they do that not because they want to grow drugs, not because they are like, oh yeah, opium is awesome, but because they're kind of forced into it by circumstance. The government of the country, combined with other, international sanctions and just the environment of the country, means that they can't make a profit. They can't successfully farm anything else, right? If they tried to go wheat or corn or rice or whatever, the environment and the laws would kind of prevent them from being able to live off of that. So if they want to be a farmer, if they want to live where their family has lived for hundreds or even thousands of years, really the only way they can survive is by growing opium, right? Here in the United States, racism has kind of grabbed various minority groups, the most famous of which, of course, is African Americans, and put them into small geographic areas, these neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, and then taken away legitimate options for advancement, right? There's study after study after study showing that it is way, way, way more difficult for a black person to get a legitimate job than a white person with equivalent experience and education and all those things. So whereas, white people in a poor neighborhood may be able to work hard in school and get a job and get out of poverty, that is way more difficult in minority areas because their schools are worse. Even if they do good in school, their job opportunities are much more difficult to come by. So it's kind of forced them into a position where one of the only real options they have is to sell drugs, right? And then, of course, there's the entire problem of addiction. You can't deter people who's addicted to a drug, right? If I'm addicted to heroin or cocaine or any one of a number of other substances, I'm not going to think rationally about, well, if I keep going out and buying this drug, I might get arrested for it. So, I think I'll just quit because I'm afraid of getting punished. No, the nature of a physical addiction means that really doesn't enter into the equation. Nobody who's physically addicted to a drug is going to think, oh, well, I don't want to go to prison, so I guess I'll quit. It is much, much more difficult, if not impossible, to deter someone from doing something that they are physically addicted to doing. Now, incapacitation, which is also something we discussed in the previous section, really doesn't work with drug selling, especially just because of replacement. We talked about this in kind of for crime in general, but it's especially true with drugs, whether you're talking about drug manufacturing, drug smuggling, drug selling. There's always somebody who is going to just, if we arrest drug smugglers or drug dealers, there's somebody ready and willing and able to step into their place and start doing what they're doing, because there is such a huge profit in it, because so many times there's very few viable alternatives for those people. So we can arrest drug sellers and drug smugglers and drug manufacturers day after day after day after day after day after day, and it's not going to impact how many drugs are being manufactured or sold one bit, because there's always somebody who's going to step in and fill that gap in the market. As long as the demand is there, as long as the money is there, no amount of arresting people is going to reduce the amount of that crime actually being committed. So, we've had this massive war on drugs since the early 70s, massively increased in the 80s. What do we have to show for it? Well, if the goal was to arrest a lot of people, it was a huge success. We have arrested millions of Americans for buying drugs or selling drugs or manufacturing drugs or smuggling drugs. Our prisons are absolutely bursting at the seams. We've got millions of people that have been arrested, been found guilty of felonies, spent time in prison, and really not a lot of other tangible outcomes from the war on drugs. No matter how much money we put into law enforcement, the drug supply we have is higher now than it really ever has been. The war on drugs didn't reduce the supply of drugs at all. Drugs are more plentiful and cheaper now than they really ever have been. How many people are using drugs and how many people are trying drugs has gone up and down, but with seemingly no connection to the drug war. How much money and effort and time we put into policing or international, working in Colombia or Afghanistan or whatever, all of those efforts seem to be completely unlinked and irrelevant to whether more people are using drugs or fewer people are using drugs or what. So these usage trends that we're able to track through various means are completely unconnected to how many people we arrest or how much money we spend and all these things. And if anything, the war on drugs increased the amount of violence and the number of shootings and murders and such, because that replacement process isn't always just a smooth, easy, somebody gets arrested, so I'm going to step into their place, right? If we arrest, say, the big newsworthy arrests of major drug smugglers in Mexico or Colombia or Nicaragua or wherever, we go in and we arrest or kill those drug smugglers, drug manufacturers, and we take down their entire network. Well, what happens then is they're replaced by others, but there's a bunch of physical violence about who gets to be the one to replace them, right? So we took down this big organization, and instead of one organization stepping up to take their place, it's 3 or 4 or 5. And then those 3 or 4 or 5 have to commit violence against each other to see who's going to be the one that survives to really take over that position. And that happens here in the United States too, right? We arrest the leaders of one street gang or even disband, we're so heavily focused on this one gang that we've arrested all their leaders. We took out most of their members. We've completely disbanded that gang. Well, now there's going to be 2 other gangs that are going to be fighting over the territory that has now become free. So we get an increase in violence. We get an increase in shootings. We get an increase in murders. We get an increase in all kinds of criminal problems as a direct result of this incapacitation and pulling people off the street and focusing on this kind of supply side drug issue. And then, of course, there's things like the DARE program, right? I went through DARE when I was in middle school. It's Drug Abuse Resistance Education. And this is one of a number of anti-drug programs that the United States has run. I just picked it out as a convenient example, but it's kind of typical of most of these programs in that there have been numerous studies that have showed that people who go through DARE as a child are actually more likely to do drugs later on in life than people who don't go through the DARE program. So basically, unless your goal was to, arrest millions of Americans and spend a whole boatload of money, the war on drugs kind of has to be seen as a failure. We spent decades of time and effort, and we really have no good, positive outcomes to show for it. So as I said a few slides ago, we're seemingly shifting track. Just over the past few decades, the United States has slowly started to kind of refocus how we're going to deal with the problem of drugs, because drugs are a problem. We get, overdose deaths are very common. Family lives are ruined because of illegal drugs. So this is an issue that policy should address. And hopefully these new policies, these new changes, everything from legalization of the minor stuff to decriminalization to drug courts to rehabilitation, hopefully those will have a much better outcome and kind of help with this issue a lot more than focusing on law enforcement and arrest and this whole war on drugs thing has over the past few decades. But that's the end of my, I guess, I won't even call that a lecture. I'll go ahead and call that a rant. So thank you for watching my rant about drug policy. I appreciate you watching. If you're still watching, know that I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. I'll see you the next time.